Hey media, today we'll cover sitcoms. Sitcoms are 30-minute entertainment television shows designed to make us laugh. We'll look at some of the characteristics, including plot and characters, as well as how much it costs to make a sitcom. Now, situation comedies are scripted. I make this point early on because certain shows, like sitcoms and dramas, are scripted. There's a written story, there are lines and dialogue, and that then is sent to the actors who play a role. This is different than reality shows, which we'll study in the future, that are more or less unscripted. Sitcoms are single slot, meaning that they're 30 minutes long. There are, of course, special occasions, maybe the end of a season, the sitcom will expand its length and do a double slot. But for the most part, single slot, 30 minutes. And the premise or the plot is self contained within the episode. So you don't necessarily have to see the episode before to make sense of the episode you're watching now. You could jump in at any season, at any point in the season, and you really don't need to know what happened in the previous episode or what's going to happen in the next episode. Sitcoms are multi-character. They usually have very large casts. Think about the show Friends as a sitcom. It has 6 main characters. The show Modern Family had 3 different families, all with spouses and grandparents, aunts, uncles, and children, all to keep track of. So a very large cast is characteristic of a sitcom. Sitcoms have double plots, meaning within that 30 minutes, we're going to have multiple problems, and before the end of the episode, we're going to solve all of those problems. So the problems will be introduced at the beginning of the episode, they'll get worse and worse and worse as the episode goes on, and then we'll solve them by the end. Now, modern sitcoms have changed a little bit. Here are some of the differences between the classic sitcoms and moderns. Conflict in modern sitcoms isn't as contained as those classic sitcoms. Sometimes a conflict will span multiple episodes. So think back to good old season 1 of The Office. There's an episode called Office Olympics. And in this episode, there are 3 main conflicts. Here's the list. We've got Jim's boredom. That's a problem. That's a conflict. Well, that one resolves itself within the episode. If you recall, they made up the Office Olympics. Boredom is cured. Check it off the list. The second conflict in this episode is that Michael is panicking about buying a home. He gets more and more worked up, and that conflict is also solved within the episode. But there's a third conflict, Jim and Pam's romantic tension, and that one isn't solved in that 30 minutes. That one goes on for episodes and seasons until we finally see a resolution to that conflict. Modern sitcoms also have some type of social commentary. Shows like Blackish or Superstore or Fresh Off the Boat are maybe making a comment on race or on workers' rights and on minimum wage. So we see that quite a bit more often in modern sitcoms. Sitcoms always follow a very similar plot that you can see here on the left. In the beginning, at least 2 conflicts, if not more, are introduced right away. Throughout the plot, as the plot progresses, our characters are trying to solve the conflict. And usually you can tell there's a little bit of a cliffhanger right before a commercial. And on Netflix, you wouldn't have commercials, but you can generally tell when there's a break in the show. As the plot progresses, we have more and more conflicts with our issue. It seems to get worse and worse and worse. But finally, in the end, our conflict is resolved. And usually all of the conflicts are resolved. Sitcoms kind of give the false idea that the world is a bright, sunny place and all of our problems will work out. And this is one of the issues with television, is that we see these happy endings. Maybe it's a week in the character's life, but in the 30-minute or 20-minute episode that we see a beginning, a middle, and an end. So often we assume that our problems are easily solvable as well. Whatever the conflict is, it usually relies upon some type of lying or deception. One character has hidden something from another character. They don't want to give them bad news, or they've damaged a piece of property that the other person owns, or they're just fooling them in some way. Sitcoms usually have new up-and-coming actors and comedians. If you think back to season 1 of Friends, none of those actors were famous, and of course they're very famous now. But that's similar with The Office. Steve Carell was mildly famous, I would say, when The Office began, but those other actors certainly weren't, and they've taken off and done a lot of things with their careers. Sitcoms have a limited setting. There are generally 2 or 3 main sets, and those are used over and over and over again. You can see in the image above me, maybe you recognize this set. They actually used it on the original version of this show, and then they brought it back for the remake on Netflix. That's the set of Full or Fuller House, if you recognize it. And over on this side, you can see another set that's recognizable. This one is from How I Met Your Mother. And if you consider How I Met Your Mother, the sets that they use there, well, we've got the bar and we've got maybe 2 or 3 apartments or 1 or 2 apartments to make a total of 2 or 3 sets. Now, every now and again, we visit Barney's office or we go to one of the characters' hometowns, but for the most part, these sets are very repetitive. Think about the show The Office. Well, of course, the office itself is a set, the warehouse, maybe the parking lot, but there aren't very many others. Every now and again, we'll go to a character's home, but most of the show is shot in that same set. Think about the show Friends. We have Central Perk, the coffee shop. We've got the girls' apartment and the boys' apartment. That's pretty much it. Every now and again, we see the characters outside or at Ross's apartment or at one of their workplaces. But for the most part, we just use the same sets over and over again. Let's talk about expense of a sitcom. Generally, sitcoms are 20 to 24 episodes, which is fairly long compared to a drama, which might be shorter. They're multi-character, and this is an expensive part because, of course, we have to pay all of the people who are acting on the show. And consider how famous these stars get over the progression of a show. Well, if the Friends characters weren't famous to begin with, they certainly were 10 seasons later when the show ended, and so they had to be paid quite a bit more. Settings are very cheap because once you build them, you can just use the same set over and over and over again. Usually there are a couple of writers, a team or a comedy team that will write together. And because these shows are single slots, that limits commercial breaks and it limits product placement. Product placement is when we integrate a brand or a product into a show. It could be a beverage or an item of clothing, or a movie that the character has gone to see. But because the show is only 20 minutes, we can only place so many products into the episode. Here are some common sitcom plots. Fish out of water is a character who just feels out of their element. And we see this on the Big Bang Theory. I know that your instinct is to talk about Sheldon, right? Because he's really bizarre and wacky and kind of lacks some social graces that the other characters do. But if you consider all of the characters on Big Bang Theory, all of them except one have something in common. They're all very brainy and intelligent, and they have these really scientific jobs. The fish out of water is really Penny, right? She's the ditzy one. She's not socially awkward like the rest of them, so she would be the fish out of water. Foils is another common plot that we see, and this is where characters dramatically oppose each other. They have opposing personalities. In Parks and Rec, we see this between a couple characters. My favorite is Leslie Knope, who's really enthusiastic and optimistic. Her foil is often anti-government and kind of gruff and rough around the edges. Ron Swanson would be her foil or her opposite. Some shows use the youthful protagonist point of view, and this is where we have a young person growing up and going through their life. Boy Meets World, Full House would all be good examples of that youthful protagonist. And parody shows are generally making fun of something more serious. The Office is about a paper company, which doesn't seem like it would be funny, but of course it is. And Superstore is about a Walmart type store, a big box store, and they're kind of making fun of the everyday scenarios.